Good afternoon. We're so glad to have you here. My name is Shelley Richardson, and I'm the Executive Director of the Statewide Independent Living Council here in Illinois. And we're so glad to have you for the webinar titled The Untold Stories of Black Deaf People and History. Before we get started, I want to do some housekeeping. First of all, please keep in mind that at the end of this webinar, we will have a quick two-question evaluation. It would really be appreciated if you could just answer those two questions for us. Also, I want you to be aware that the webinar is being recorded. It will be posted next week to our website if you want to share it with others. So, description of myself. I am a little beyond a middle-aged white woman with red hair and glasses, and I'm wearing a flowered top, and I'm sitting in my office today. My pronouns are she and her. During this presentation, there will be some questions that our presenter is going to ask you. And if you will respond to those questions in the chat, not the question and answer, but the chat. And if you look at the bottom of your screen, you will see that there is the chat icon. And then the question and answer we'll be taking the answers at the end of the webinar. So if you have questions, if you put it in the Q&A, and then if you will answer the questions that are asked within the presentation, if you will put that in the chat, we would greatly appreciate it. We have with us today that is going to take over our presenting our speaker and things like that. We have Herschel Jackson, and he is from the Illinois-Iowa Center for Independent Living. We also have Angela Botts, who will be fielding the questions for you guys, and she works for Impact Center for Independent Living. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Herschel. Thanks, guys.
Well, thank you so much for the introduction. This is Herschel, Herschel Jackson, and I do work at Central Illinois Independent Living Center here. And here's the background.
Illinois-Iowa Center.
So we have different work for deaf culture and history and things like that. And also,
I'm wearing a
here
green shirt and glasses.
I'd like to introduce Benro Oganipi. Benro is my friend, but he's also the director of the Illinois Deaf and Hard of Hearing Commission, IDHHC, and he served director for 6 years, president and vice president, and chairperson for the National Black Deaf Advocates. And in 2014 and 2016, United States President Barack Obama appointed him to serve on the National Commission for Disabilities. Monroe also has been selected in 3 other different positions and worked in other areas of government and has served on various committees at the national level. And he's a member of the National Association of the Deaf as a board member. So, Benro, here you go.
Thank you so much. Angela, did you want to say anything?
No, I'm just really looking forward to your presentation is all.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I am a Black man. I am wearing glasses. I have black hair. I have a suit jacket on. I'd say it's blue plaid. I have a vest covering a white collared shirt. My background behind me is a wall, and I have a framed picture behind me of Martin Luther King Jr., and I have a little messy of a desk. I apologize. So right now I'm going to share my PowerPoint presentation. Can everyone see my slides okay? All right. My presentation is the untold stories of Black deaf people in history. I want to tell the stories of the deaf that are part of the Black culture. Of course, this month is Black History Month. I'm sure you are all aware. It is every year in the month of February. It is recognized and that is all over looked at and recognized as a place for Black individuals to tell their stories about history and where they've come and empowerment. I'm sure you've learned every year that there's some, new things added to Black history. And I think that we're going to continue to find out more and more throughout the years. You'll find out through movies, documentaries, books, television stories. The list can go on and on. So this month and this topic is really unique because it affects a deaf person differently. They do have a culture and a story to tell as well with the history of being Black and deaf. They experienced segregation, they experienced oppression and forms of diversity. I know there's a lot um, of things that might not all be covered today in this short time we have, but I'm hoping that this will lead to you wanting to do some more online research, looking into learning more about the Black deaf population. So my background, in summary, I'm from Chicago, Illinois. I'm currently the executive director of the Illinois Deaf and Hard of Hearing Commission. This is my 5th year. My education background is I served at, I had a master's degree in public administration. I was on the National Council on Disability. I'm a part of the National Black Deaf Advocates Incorporation, and I also sit on the National Association of State Agencies of the Deaf and Hard of Hearing.
I'm sorry, Benro and Sabrina, give me one pause while I figure your screen out. I'm hearing that you're not seeing you, so I've made a couple adjustments. I don't think that was any better. Can folks comment now? I'm not seeing the interpreter because I've pinned Benro. Remove pin. All right. Do you want to share your, see now for me, you're very big. Is that what everybody wants? But now I can hardly see your.
Oh. So the audience is able to see a split screen right now? Are they able to see me as well as my presentation?
Yeah, I had him spotlighted to begin with. Let's remove spotlight and spotlight. That spotlight. I mean, for me, it was fine. I'm hearing from the chat that it wasn't. Side-by-side speakers. Can somebody tell me what that looks like on attendee side? Grace says she's good now. We can see Benro. Now you guys know that you can stretch your screen between the PowerPoint and the speakers. If I'm hearing that everything's good, we can continue. Okay, I apologize.
Oh, that's okay. I will proceed. Everybody can see? Can you see my signing as well as my PowerPoint?
Yes.
Okay. Should I start over or just continue from here?
Continue from here, please.
I see a comment that they can see the interpreter. That might mean that it's on speaker view. You might have to change your view in the corner. I was a part of the NBDA, that is the National Black Deaf Advocates, NBDA. That is where I learned a lot more about the Black deaf history. I never learned that in school. In college, the university, I went into my adult life never knowing that that group existed and that there was a need to talk about this. So I like to start with a quiz question. This month of February is Black History Month, and in other countries around the world, when do you think they celebrate Black History Month? Do you know the countries of the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, Ireland? Do you know which months they celebrate? I'm seeing in the chat, people are saying maybe October. No, there's maybe no celebrations. I'm seeing October for the UK, the United Kingdom. Okay, thank you. Yes, it is October in these three other countries besides Canada and United States. That is when they celebrate and recognize Black History Month. And in the rest of the world, it is viewed as an observance. This is a picture of a variety of different individuals who are all Black and deaf. They have all made a significant tribute to society, to US history. We have Black deaf lawyers, we had boxer, we've had teachers, many educators, deaf educators, a lot of role models, and that's really important for the US. I'm not going to name each one. I will, in my presentation, select a few to explain. The Black deaf community can be described as a group of individuals who live in a hearing and color conscious society. %87 Black deaf are respondents. They identify themselves as Black and deaf. So that means they label themselves Black first before they identify deaf. You see, I am Black first. My deafness is not noticed until I speak or use my hands to communicate. Black deaf individuals lived in a segregated era. Society viewed Black individuals, didn't matter if they were deaf or they could hear, but that's what they viewed them for before they identified them as Black. Black deaf individuals do experience oppression almost double because they have it as oppression from being deaf as well as the color of their skin. In the US, racial segregation was a priority before they could identify as being deaf. In the South, the law forced segregation for anyone that was hanging out in an area could not have Black and white individuals socializing together. And that affected the deaf community as well, because the deaf community wanted to be able to socialize, but society set this law that forced the white and the Blacks to stay separate. And even the deaf had to follow those. I feel like it was from the 1800s all the way up until 1970s. It was a long time when from the 1880s to 1970s this was viewed. This author is Dr. Joseph Hill. He mentioned about Jim Crow's law in the South. With this law, it forced the communities to segregate. It reduced the community's contact with each other. This is a chart showing what it could look like as racial and social barriers. The community that's Black and could hear, the community that's Black deaf community, as well as the American society, predominantly white, and then the deaf community, predominantly white, and how they weren't able to really socialize. And the Black deaf were kind of stuck in the center of social barriers as well as racial barriers. They weren't able to communicate with one another. They would need a sign language interpreter like I'm using today. And then there was also racial barriers they faced. In the United States, the education system in history has shown that there was segregation in the school system. As you can see from this map of the United States, the red states were very strict about segregation as it related to education. Some states required the professor to be white, teaching the white students, and the Black teacher would be the one teaching the Black students. That was a requirement. And maybe you are aware of the history where the classrooms had to be segregated between Black and white. They couldn't share the same classroom. That influenced and impacted the deaf community as well, having that segregation between racial groups. Oh, Angela? I see. It's okay. This map, I'll show you some more slides that looks a little bit closer at this topic. Another quiz question. This US state became the first state to open a segregated school for Black deaf students. Does anybody know? Somebody in the chat said Virginia. I'm seeing Virginia again. Illinois. Oh. Any other comments or guesses to the question? Remember, it's mostly in the southern states. So Illinois wouldn't be considered a southern state, unfortunately. The answer is North Carolina, the first segregated school for Black deaf students. They had a school for the general deaf, and then they had to set up a separate school that was not with the white deaf students. So due to funding, the state had to allocate funds to put another school in the same state to make sure that it'd be funded for the Black students that were deaf, and then the other school was for the white deaf students. All good?
So
In
it was in
1868,
1868, North Carolina became one of the first schools that had students in the U.S. Understand what happened was for some schools prior to that time, North Carolina, some of the schools did have segregation. However, North Carolina, the whole statewide, had state funding that was spent that way. So, in other words, tax money was appropriated there. There was some segregated schools for the deaf who did have people who graduate high school, and at that point, they would actually receive a diploma. However, some of the segregated schools would only give a certification or a certificate of completion. Now, that certificate of completion didn't necessarily show you were successful and could move on to college. It restricted job opportunities as well. Some states didn't even award either a certificate or a high school diploma. And so there was that. Right here, there's a picture of the Kentucky School for the Deaf. So when you look at the picture here, this is a picture of some of the older Black deaf people who actually got honorary diplomas or had a celebration because when they had graduated, well, when they attended high school, and then 60 years earlier, I believe this was 2011. So 60 years prior, they'd gone to school and never got recognition for completing their education. Neither a certificate of completion nor a diploma. So they went through until finally, somehow they're able to locate those people and realize that they'd never been recognized. So some, of course, had already passed away, but these others were recognized and with some apology because they didn't receive any certificate and actually lost opportunities. So they hosted a special celebration to acknowledge those people and to award them for completing high school, even though it was 60 years prior. I see a comment here that said somebody wanted the interpreter to talk louder. All right. Okay, can you hear okay now? All right. Well, we'll go ahead and go on. Okay. So there was other situations where also instances where the school or the students never got a diploma of any sort for completing their education. So those schools were in DC a long time ago. They blocked deaf Black students from participating. They weren't even allowed to get recognized for completing their education. It wasn't until just a couple of years ago, finally, they received their high school diploma, like 70 years later. Wow. And some people had already passed away. So they never got those opportunities to receive their diplomas. However, their family members would show up to receive those on their behalf. Any questions about that? We have another quiz question for you. Which court ruled, maybe you already know this, Brown versus the Board of Education, that the Supreme Court had decided that segregation was illegal and required that each school who practiced segregation start to practice integration. And that was really a landmark case a long time ago. Many of you would know what year that probably happened. And do you know what town? That could be bonus points. 1960s. Topeka, Kansas. All right. Pretty good. You must know your history. Yep, there it is. 1954, Topeka, Kansas. Of course, there was no history classes that would show that no books to read with regards to the history. And a lot of times the Supreme Court case was just so vital to influencing the practice of allowing all children, regardless of their race, to be integrated. Now, there is some history related to Black deaf individuals that many people don't know. 2 years prior to this 1954 case, the determination, what had happened was Black deaf students had filed a suit with the Supreme Court with regards to segregation of Black deaf students and white children. So 1952, Miller versus the DC Board of Education. What happened was in 1951, there was a mother of a Black deaf child, a student there, who wanted to try and enter the school in Washington, D.C., and the Black mother and the son lived in Washington, D.C., and the school said, sorry, this is only for white students. And, it was a school for the deaf at that time. And the mom filed suit against the school in Washington, D.C. against the D.C. Board of Education. That was 2 years before 1954 when they filed and won those extra requirements to have students be put in. Now understand, the school still had some segregation within the building. In other words, they have a classroom for white students and there'd be a different classroom for Black students. So technically it was still segregated. However, then 2 years after that, Topeka, Kansas was when they filed that suit. And so it was really related to that precursor from 1952, where that mom had filed suit in Washington, D.C. So, you think in 1954 was the beginning of it, but really it's kind of a piece of hidden history because the mother filed a suit on behalf of a Black deaf child in 1952. Well, now the Kendall School, where that happened, is on the campus of Gallaudet University. So now Gallaudet is setting up a way to honor and establish some kind of celebration to acknowledge and recognize those people through the years. Remember, I just showed you this previous slide. 1 second. That one. Whereas the Kendall School, that's because that's where that happened, where the mother filed her suit against them. Okay, so there was 1954, the Supreme Court made their determination that ordered those schools who practice segregation to be integrated, to have Black and white students integrated. But that was 1954. However, some states refused to comply with the Supreme Court order. They went ahead and continued to practice segregation in education. And some states had their own laws. So by 1958, you can see the bottom there, that yellow highlighted section. By 1958, only 7 states were still running with segregation. They paid no attention to the Supreme Court order. They just ran things the way they wanted to. So it took time for some states to figure out, okay, fine, we'll go ahead and we'll cease with segregation and start integration because, well, the federal funding was key. And so they were afraid they'd lose their federal funding. And so it's kind of a threat from the federal government. If you don't go and do integration, we're going to not give you your money. You won't have the resources you had before. So some of the states went ahead and complied with the integration. Now, the last state to integrate Black and deaf students with, well, mainstreamed white students. You have any idea what the answer could be or which state it was? And what year? One person said Mississippi, then there was Georgia, Hawaii. Funny. I don't know. I don't even know if Hawaii was a state yet, but Alaska, Alabama, Texas. You're all wrong. Okay, a couple more. Come on, come on. Make a guess. Okay, we'll say it's in the South. Remember, I just said there were 7 states that refused to comply. Remember those 7 states? Louisiana? Okay, the correct answer is Louisiana. Louisiana was the final state. That was 1978. You know what that means? That means that people who attended that segregated school until 1978 are still living today. Right? They're still living today. So 1978, recently there were some people who felt like, oh, wow, that was amazing. They were still practicing segregation. Wow, from 1954, where the Supreme Court said you have to integrate. It took more than 20 additional years for them to finally close those segregated schools and create integration. So, like when I served as president of the Black Deaf Advocates, the National Black Deaf Advocates, well, I can explain a little bit about that National Black Deaf Advocates later. However, that organization had several members from different states all over the US, and they'd host a conference. So I met several different people, older people from Louisiana. And I noticed that some of them signed differently. I noticed their signs and their hand shapes weren't American Sign Language to me. I thought ASL was more standardized, but their signs were very different. And I said, hey, what's that sign? What's this sign? Because, I mean, some languages have like Creole, for example, or, more like dialect. At least that's what I noticed. Then I learned, and I didn't even realize this. They'd gone to a segregated school for the deaf. Like, oh, wow. So it just was shocking to realize that I learned something new about that time because I was serving as the president, of course, of the national organization. Nobody taught anything about the schools or the education at that time. And there you go. That's the same message we just talked about. Okay, I have a quick video to show you. There isn't any voiceover for this. It does have captioning. And some of the video is signed. You might see that some of the sign gestures are different. But I'll play the video along with the captions. Baton Rouge, Louisiana. State School for the Deaf was segregated for Black deaf students in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. School opened in 1938 and was the last deaf school in the United States to integrate when it was incorporated. This is where the old deaf school used to be, right back in here. The school is located on the campus of Southern University and was founded in 1938 and closed in 1978. Then it was incorporated into the campus of Louisiana School for the Deaf. Recently, a group of friends gathered at the old campus to share memories about their time as students at SSD. My mom and papa and brothers said, "What? I wanted to go to school." They're like, "Oh, they left for joy." And then the superintendent spake me. I cried. I want to go home. But things got better as the days went by, and I was fine. It was great. My memories of school here, it was comfortable to be here. We were among other deaf students. In the hearing world, I was very aware of the separations between white and black people. We weren't allowed to sign in class. We had to fingerspell everything in the classroom. I remember how we signed differently than white people too. Our communication was different. Instead of school, we had this other gesture for school that looked more like a book. Oh yeah, I remember that. Like there was another sign for copy like that. We used a different gesture for copy. Or like it's none of your business. We had a different sign for none of your business. And there was a sign for told, a different sign for told. Dang it, you're too smart. You're just too smart. Time for you to go to church and pray. Yeah, we know a sign for church was our sign for pray, right? The old superintendent, he would whip us. He was mean, that superintendent, and I hated it. If you asked him something for the first time, he would say he didn't know. He was funny. He was the boss. At school, we slept in our beds in robes. We'd get up early and make us get up all at once. Then we'd all be lined up. We'd be all lined up. We're trying to keep track of who might be getting ready to eat. They served us oats that tasted funny, and we'd make these faces when we ate it. It was different from how my mom and dad served it. And so all the teachers were black. All the teachers were black. Sundays, a nun and a priest would come to campus. They were white. They could sign, and deaf students would look at them and they'd learn more. Like the Hail Mary and the Lord's Prayer, because we'd all been fingerspelling all that. Oh, we had to do a lot of work.
Outside of here, it felt different. My children just don't have it. I used to have to work harder. The younger generation is so different. The old campus is located on the campus of the Southern University. The alumni of the school gather annually for school reunions. There is a history here at SSD. It's a history I want my children to know about. I want them to remember what it was like here. It's a history worth cherishing, the history of SSD. Well, thank you for watching that clip. This film was produced, I believe, in 2020. So my jaw dropped when I watched this. And I found out, like, wow, this really was a segregated school and all that was a part of the Black deaf culture and how separate it was. There was no instructors that taught us this in school for me. And I think it's interesting today that there's more people learning, and they're learning through social media. People say that they feel, it's intentional to hide history, but you can always try and hide it. But once the light comes to it, you can't hide it anymore. I met two of those men that were shown in the film when I was president, working with the NBDA, and they would make comments about their memories looking back and all the different signing styles they had and the signing accents or dialect. And I always asked them why they signed it differently. And they said with American Sign Language, it was a standardized language here in the United States. And the Black deaf students were forbidden to use that. They weren't able to go into the white school. So they then had to develop their own form of sign language to communicate. So that's why BSL, Black Sign Language, is a little bit different. It has history to it, and it was developed as their own language in a way for them to be able to communicate with other students and with their teachers. Okay, quiz number 5. True or false? The U.S. states in the South enforced racial segregation and prohibited the integration of Black and white people in public areas. Black deaf people were prohibited from interacting with predominantly white deaf community for more than 100 years. True or false? I'm seeing true. Seeing true. Okay. A lot of trues in the chat. Okay. Thank you for answering the quiz question. And you're right, it is true. Sociolinguistics is how you socialize and you develop that interaction with one another. For the Black deaf residential school or the deaf school, they were segregated and had to create their own language, which became Black Sign Language. They would use parts of ASL, American Sign Language, but since they were segregated and not able to use that language in that school system, the widespread known ASL, they then had to create a system to communicate. They wanted to develop their own language, and that is where Black ASL was established. It was between 1856 and the time when the schools for the deaf were finally desegregated in the late 1970s. Black deaf children and adults did not interact with white deaf children and adults on a regular basis. I want you to understand that this mostly happened in the southern states, where the laws were set to create the segregation between the Black and white communities. So they weren't able to be on public transportation. It was very hard. If the white person was the first in line, they got to go on the bus, and the Black person would have to then wait. If they were at a restaurant, they would have to be the last in line. They'd have to let the white individual go first. And so with the deaf community, they had to follow the same rules. The white and Black deaf individuals weren't able to socialize either. Yes. And as you saw in the chat, the restroom signs and the water fountains, everything was segregated in the South. I couldn't even imagine experiencing that segregation. And the line in the middle is the black line, and it's showing the Black deaf community, and there's deaf community using the standard ASL, and there's Black deaf community using Black ASL. And with segregation, this was something they had to follow based on the law. They had to follow the segregation laws. So Black deaf individuals, I would say adults who experienced segregated schools, do use something that we call code switching. And that means that they would sign one way with an individual, and then they would switch to another style of sign language depending on who they were speaking to. We have CODAs, which stands for Children of Deaf Adults. CODAs are born to parents that are deaf. That child is able to hear or could be deaf and is called a CODA. When their parents maybe experienced the segregated schools, they would sign those styles of language, and the child would then learn it from their parents and go into their school setting having to code switch. It was really hard for that generation if they wanted to maybe become an interpreter or be in an interpreting preparation program, an IPP. It was hard because nobody would understand their dialect and their signing style. But they would say at home and my school, this is how we would sign. And then they realized the history of their parents and the segregated experiences they had, how it affected the language. So then they would have to code switch and then bring in the new signs or the American Sign Language that they were using with their peers. And then as an interpreter, it's a challenge having to take different styles of a language and really translate it. And an ASL interpreter would take American Sign Language and place it into English. Well, when you have this type of experience, you have a person then having to translate it English to ASL and ASL to Black ASL. Good job, interpreter. I caught her lag time. So now, prohibition and racial discrimination in deaf organizations. An organization is really, it plays an important role in a group of individuals' lives. It could be, the NAACP. We all know that organization we've heard of. There's organizations for women's rights, women who fight for women's rights to vote, for equality. We have Black organizations that are fighting for civil rights, for Black individuals in employment and their voting rights. So we do have deaf organizations. They have been at all different levels, local, state, and nationwide. And what would happen is a Black deaf person would have to fight to be given this chance and a right to be a part of that organization. And unfortunately, the white deaf organizations weren't going to accept a Black individual, so they wanted them to develop their own. And that was, again, based off what had happened in history. So NAD, the National Association of the Deaf, welcomed Black deaf members at first. And it was, a nationwide association. It's been set up since 1920s, 1880s about, and then in the 1920s, NAD figured out that they could, allow some deaf Black to be a part of the NAD until the early 20s. They figured out that the laws had to change to prohibit Black deafs from becoming members. NAD did not allow Black deaf individuals to join as members or have voting rights for 40 years. During that time, the Black deaf individuals wanted an organization. If NAD, this nationwide organization fighting for deaf rights, won't accept us, what will we do? How can we get the support and help for our rights? So back then, there was a specific deaf Black organization. And after World War II, Black deaf people found themselves needing a place, so they began forming their own club. There were congregations that they would meet, organizations they would meet. And in the 1950s and 1960s, in the urban cities, there were a large number of Black deaf residents. They lived in bigger cities, and that's where they would set up these Black deaf organizations like Atlanta, Baltimore, Chicago, Los Angeles, and Washington, D.C. I want to show you some pictures of organizations that were developed and established back then. These are Black deaf clubs, organizations in the 1950s and 60s. I have listed out the names: Washington Silent Society, Lincoln Club for the Deaf, Blue Jay Club for the Deaf in Los Angeles, the Ebony Club for the Deaf in Atlanta, the Baltimore Silence Club. Here's a picture of the Philadelphia and Washington Ball in the early 1950s. This is a picture to show them getting together for this club. This is a deaf congregation in Baltimore, Maryland, around 1951. This is a picture of the Washington Silent Society Bowling Club from 1950. This is a Thanksgiving dance in November of 1959 at the Philadelphia Club for the Deaf. Again, this is the Philadelphia and Washington Silence Club. It was a get-together, a May dance in 1947. This picture seems very important to share in social media platforms. It's been shared in books, and it's an important part of history. That's why we share it. And there are Black deaf women organizations and clubs. Around the 1970s, when the women's rights movement spurred Black deaf women's interest in establishing their own Black deaf women's clubs. Now moving on to 1965, NAD ended the prohibition on not allowing Black deaf members into having voting rights. And it says in 1964, the Civil Rights Act was signed by the U.S. President, Lyndon B. Johnson. And then the following year, 1965, NAD opened membership for the Black deaf people to join. In 2012, that year is when I served as a president of NBDA from 2011 to about 2013. And during that year of 2012 is when NAD, the National Association, recognized and apologized for its past denial of equal rights to the Black deaf individuals on the basis of race. In 1980, this picture shows a beginning of a Black deaf renaissance. That in the 80s is when many Black deaf individuals started getting together to try to advocate more for what their rights were and come together to face that oppression and see where they were getting that oppression and no advocacy from NAD or from other Black individuals. So they decided to work on, in about July 6th of 1980 in Ohio, in Cleveland. This is a newspaper clipping. Explained how the deaf Black individuals were fed up. They wanted NAD to help. They wanted their support, and they decided to then set up a new organization if NAD wasn't going to help them. So in 1981 was the first Black Deaf Conference. It was in Washington, D.C. It was at Howard University, and the deaf Black worked together to see different professions come together, mental health and social work, education. They all wanted to empower the community to work together for their rights. And that following year, 1982, the organization NBDA, the National Black Deaf Association Advocates, was established in Cleveland, Ohio. And this is a book from the Black Deaf Advocates. It's a National Conference Program book. All right, have you been paying attention? I'm ready to quiz you. This was a few slides ago. What is the name of a National Black Deaf organization? What year was the organization officially established? Any guesses? Any comments? NBDO? NBDA? Someone wrote in the chat they're thinking it was the 1970s. Any other comments or guesses? Someone wrote 80s, 82. That was a good guess. I will show you. The National Black Deaf Advocates was 1982.
So the National Black Deaf Advocates organization was primarily an advocacy organization for Black deaf people. It wasn't really a civil rights organization at the time. It wasn't branded that way. It was more of an advocacy organization, not so much a legal focused group to give people resources to work for their own rights. It's been more than 40 years up and running, and it's still active today. There's different chapters in different states. Was it? Well, a few years ago, in a few years, it will be 50 years old. And there'll probably be a big celebration for the 50-year anniversary. So now, as far as Black deaf people, their history, their stories are so important. They got published. There's movies, there's films. These particular book was one of the first ones in the 1983, I believe. Yeah, I think it's 1983. That's right. 1983 was one of the first places where they printed the Black deaf experience. How their experiences were different. Black hearing people had a different experience. Now Black deaf people had a different experience. And what they wanted to do was share those experiences. Job opportunities were kind of sketchy. Access to education and access to resources were very different. And I'd say that back book really is outdated at this point. If you went into maybe Amazon or something like that, I think it's out of print. So it's something that we've kind of kept track of, the few copies we still have of that book. Now, I do have several books that talk about Black deaf people and their experiences. Some of them are historical, some of them are current. They're varied. Some are with regards to segregation in schools, and there's a new book right now, Georgia School for the Deaf. Used to be segregated, and it's got a story about that. Go ahead. Somebody has a question. Historically, well, history is just so important. I previously served on the NAD, National Association of the Deaf board. I was a board member. I did that for 2 years. 2018? I want to say 2018. And the board would hold meetings in different states across the United States and at different schools for the deaf. Oh, I think I got to almost all 50 states. Not all 50, but almost all 50 states would have some school for the deaf. And the first thing you do when you get there is we'd have a tour. We'd tour the classrooms, look at the facilities, meet the teachers, all kinds of things like that. And almost all the schools for the deaf had their own museum. So we went to the North Carolina School for the Deaf. That was really impressive. I was just wondering what they had there in North Carolina, because I had recalled, or I knew, that the North Carolina school, I'm sorry. The state of North Carolina was the first state to establish segregated schools for deaf students. So when we went to North Carolina, the residential school, of course, at that time it was not segregated. It was much more just a general school for the deaf. And for deaf students, it didn't matter whether you were white or black. We went there, and I just kind of wondered what the museum might look like. So on the tour, I asked for a tour of the museum and looked around. They had all kinds of historical pictures, things about the students. It was very nicely done. Then I asked the tour director, museum director, I asked them, did you know this was one of the first states to establish segregation for deaf students in the schools? And I said, do you have any information or history with regards to that new museum? And that particular director said, well, it kind of looks sad, actually, and said, well, yes, we previously showed that. I was like, great. So he took me to any other board members to an area where they showed that. And they said, really? That's all you got? It seemed like maybe it was less than 5 pictures altogether. It was very limited materials. I was like, that's all you have? So we looked at those and just had very limited information with regards to, like, the first Black deaf student who graduated from the segregated school. They really didn't have more information. I wanted more. Like, who are the teachers? Did they have any sporting events? How did that part of the school close? Where are those people at now? And the museum director said, well, we did try to contact people and collect more materials, like old yearbooks or things like that, or things from those time when the students were here, so we could preserve our history. However, apparently it was too late. So many had already passed away. And seemingly, many of the staff members didn't know that information, or that their school had previously been segregated. They didn't know anything about that history. However, how segregation operated really varied. In other words, in some states, for example, School for the Deaf, where the white students might be in one city, and then the other city, maybe 1 or 2 hours away, as much as 3 hours away, might be for the Black deaf students. They were that segregated. However, the white students didn't even know the Black students were over there. So then those Black schools would fold, and they had no idea because they didn't have a way to preserve those materials and that history. And then some of the states had a white deaf facility and a Black deaf facility, but they were on the same campus, but separate buildings. Or some of them might be on the same campus, but they'd have just separate departments. Maybe what they do is allow a Black deaf student and a white deaf student to socialize, like during recess, for example, playtime, something like that. However, in the classroom, they still had to be segregated for educational purposes. It depended on each state and the state law. It really did. I remember I mentioned earlier that some schools or some states required Black teachers for Black students and white teachers for white students. And of course, that would have an influence on deaf students as well. And that created quite a challenge. Because the question was, is there a white deaf teacher who could sign, who was actually bilingual, could do English and ASL? Would they be a better teacher? And the challenge was, in the day, there were very few or really weren't any Black deaf instructors for the Black deaf students. So they would have a hearing Black teacher and for the Black deaf students. And some of those hearing Black teachers were not even signing. But in some of those situations, where to be a Black deaf student, they were actually teaching the Black hearing teacher some sign language. And then the hearing teacher, Black hearing teacher, could then go back and teach the content based on the signs that they learned from the students. In the past couple of years, 2020, there's something that was seen on TV. It was a huge documentary that documented the Black deaf experience and the sign languages used. So I think that might be my last slide before I open up for some questions. I would say maybe 10 years ago or so, history with regards to Black deaf people has really taken off. Like it's in the national, local news. You'll see stories. Newspapers have highlighted or spotlighted history of the Black deaf experience and of Black deaf individuals. In major news, NBC, CBS, and even Canada spotlight some Black deaf experiences. I guess I find it so interesting, so different, and that the sign language is different as to how hearing people and Black deaf people view that. So there's the Washington Post, New York Times. I want to say 2020 was like Black Lives Matter. During that time, there was a great increase in the focus on those experiences. And there was more and more Black deaf historians, and there was more study on Black deaf history. Remember, I mentioned earlier that when I started to serve as president of the NBDA, that's where I learned most about the Black history, which I didn't even know. about segregation and different sign language systems. As an adult, I was learning those things. So, oh gosh, I want to say that happened, what, 2013 was when I was done being president, and 12 years. And what I've noticed is a great increase in the focus on, well, of course, social media and access there has really ballooned. And social media has an impact as well as TV, film, newspapers to retell those stories. Gallaudet established a Center for Black Deaf Studies to support the growth of those stories. And I think I already talked about the social media part. All right. Well, I don't know. Maybe we'll finish early. I'm not sure, but I'm open to any questions you have.
Remember to put your questions in the question and answer queue. If you're having trouble getting to that, go ahead and put it in the chat, and we can read them from there also. But
Okay, sure.
Right.
Okay, I do see one question here. Let me grab my glasses.
Would you like me to read that question out loud? Okay, the question. I wonder about the use of the word standard and standard ASL. Are there any significant differences between signs of ASL in the southern states versus northern or other regional areas in the US? Also, are the distinctions of Black ASL large, significant enough to be considered a different language? Or is it a of the wider use?
Yeah. Well, it really is a very good question because, it affects the Black deaf community and the use of, well, what we call ASL, right? So, gosh, I do want to mention that ASL is not really a universal sign language in and of itself. There are many, many, many differences. Of course, sign systems across the world, just as foreign speakers have different language use and there's different sign systems. However, for American Sign Language, it does have its own syntax, rules, grammar structure, all those things. And just like English has proper grammar rules and things like that. The same thing would be true of American Sign Language, however. In each region, there are different signs for similar things, for similar words, for example. So like New York, it's like having a New York accent instead of a California accent. It's the same idea with sign language. So there'd be like a word and they use a signage for the same word in a different way, but that doesn't, there's one that's right or one that's wrong, because quite honestly, it just depends on where you live and where you grew up. However, similarly, with Black ASL, the sign might be a word from the state of Louisiana, that might be a different sign in North Carolina, even though it's the same word. They're used differently. And then, so like now, Black ASL, well, many people say they don't want to even call it Black ASL as a dialect, because honestly, it's its own language, because it has its own sociolinguistic impact that those groups have shared as part of being segregated, and how they develop their own communication style, which means their own language to communicate with one another. So that's why probably we'd still call it Black ASL. It's a more official language, than it is a dialect of ASL. So a lot of times to access ASL, there's some frustration there. So linguistically, Black ASL is unique. Okay, some other questions.
From Eric Brown. First of all, thank you for this. It's been very informative. What led you to become president during your time? And how has the club changed since your presidency?
Why? Well, why did I become president of the National Black Deaf Advocates? Well, I started to get involved at the local chapter level in Chicago. So they had us the Chicagoland Black Deaf Advocates. And each chapter has their own like BDA. They all end with BDA, Black Deaf Advocates, but then they might have an initial beginning, because each town or state, for example, I think there's Tennessee BDA, New York, or New York City BDA, Washington BDA. So they'll have those different regional clubs. And I decided that I just wanted to move up and get more involved on the national level, maybe become vice president. So I was vice president twice and then decided to run for president. Because what I noticed was that, apparently there was a real hunger, a desperation for advocacy because Black deaf people, I guess, they had a network, they had different organizations, they owned businesses, and they needed support in different ways. So we really worked to support the Black deaf community and get access to resources and to understand their civil rights. So that was really, really a good experience for me, to be involved at the national organization, but it was quite a challenge because there were such limited resources. It was a national organization, but at the same time, it was an organization with limited resources. So that was a really good experience. It was a good experience for me because that's where I learned about Black deaf history. And I felt like, getting into getting education about what happened there, things I never realized, things I never thought about before because I didn't have any information about them, even though I'm Black and an ASL user myself.
All right. The next question says, do you still see the different dialects of ASL from segregation still affecting communication in the community today?
Well, yeah. Chicago Black deaf community, of course, is where I grew up. And they have different sign systems. And then you go to like Gallaudet, where I graduated in Washington, D.C. And wow. I'm like, wow, I'm trying to understand that. Whoa, your sign's wrong. And they're like, no, my sign's not wrong. That's the sign we use where I'm from. So like Florida has a different sign. And then so over time, what I saw today, hearing Black people have like AAVE, African American vernacular. So sorry, I'm misspeaking when I say this, but so they speak the way the Black culture is with their accent or how things sound, the nuances that are in the language are still understandable. However, for formal English, that person may not be understood. Well, the same thing happens with sign languages. For some Black deaf people, they might sign with some type of variance like, hey, what's up? Or, they'll be more like influenced by, wait a minute, but I don't know. They might just mean it a different way. I don't know. Maybe I'm just not giving a good example, but how to understand is different than standard English. And sign language is the same way. So sign language doesn't always apply because it's not standardized ASL because there's differences there. So in other words, we need to get, an interpreter who really understands those nuances between the different languages, ASL, and they need to be able to code switch follow exactly what's being said in Black ASL, and that happens to be quite a challenge. To find somebody who's an interpreter who can culturally accommodate all that means like a Black interpreter has to be a trilingual interpreter to have an understanding of the language use.
Right, there's more questions. Can you talk about what barriers you feel most impact Black individuals now and what we can do as allies and advocates to amplify and advocate for the community?
I really wish I could have the answer myself, but I don't know all the answers. So I would say with my education, it's not specialized in that area. So I would want to bring in somebody who has that specialized education for that specific issue. Maybe it's a mental health issue. Bring in a professional who understands the Black deaf individuals in that culture and in that setting. So bringing people in from the field, so that way there is no barriers. I feel like partnerships are the most important, being able to collaborate with other deaf individuals and making sure that whatever resources are available, make sure that those are accessible for the Black deaf and all deaf, because it's the same concept for a deaf blind individual. They need accommodations and accessibilities to things, and there's a lot of barriers they face. They might need Braille, they might need a tactile interpreter. So whatever programs you're working with, make sure that deaf blind person feels included. It's the same. Make sure the Black deaf individual is included to receiving the same access. We really want to make sure that people stay open-minded, and it's a process to really learn all of this and finding out more information on how to make everything more accessible.
And another one, I came in late, so I apologize if you've already addressed this, but can you give examples of words that would be different in Black ASL or other part versus other parts of the country?
Let me think here. Let me think of a good one. So I need you to understand is when you're talking about the segregation at that time of sign language, it is very different because again, they were at that segregated school. So it was something that they had created. I don't know if you got to see the video. I don't know how late you came in, but in my presentation, I showed a video and it showed the students in that segregated school. And so then this is the sign for church, but they would sign this as like prayer, but that would mean church to them. We would sign film in ASL. And for them in the segregated school, they signed it like this, like you're actually filming something, because that's what it looked like. It was the kind of description of what the camera looked like while having a film. Let me think. Like ASL, the sign is chicken. This is how you sign it in American Sign Language. For Black ASL, there used to be different variances. I think there was chicken. Maybe they signed chicken down here. I've seen chicken, like a chicken wing. I've seen chicken, just the wing. I've seen it down by the hip area. And again, it was developed by something that they had seen and they had created as their language. For American Sign Language, it's become a little bit more formalized. There's a little bit more correction if the hand shape is off or the facial expressions aren't matching what the grammar shows in American Sign Language. There's variances there. And I believe there is, could I show a short film? Do we have time? I do have an example of a Black deaf individual in their family that had went to a segregated school, and I can show you how they signed differently. It's about 2 minutes. Just a second. Let me set that up. This is my name sign, Charmaine. I'm 22 years old. I'm the fourth deaf generation of 5 generations. And this is called What You Know About That, BASL, Black American Sign Language. It's a dialect of American Sign Language. It's still a language. It was developed by Black deaf people in the 1800s and the 1900s during segregation. For reference, the first American school for the deaf was created in 1817, but only started admitting Black students in 1952. As a result, Black communities had a different means of language socialization. BASL was born. There's a big difference between BASL and ASL. BASL has a little seasoning. Honestly, it's different than ASL. With BASL, we sign with both hands, and ASL is typically one-handed. For example, in ASL, we would sign, "You're my business, don't do that." In BASL, we would say, "Stop being nosy, mind your own business." There are differences in individual words as well. Like in ASL, we sign Christmas with a C as a tree, and in BASL, we sign it differently. Curious, there's 2 different signs. Hurt, we sign it differently. Children, you could see from this video, there's very differences. A lot of people didn't know until my video went viral that BASL was a thing. They're really curious. They wanted to learn more about BASL in history. I told my grandfather the video went viral, and he said, "Really? Keep it going." My favorite comment I saw was, "Can we preserve this language too?" And I thought the same. We can. I have a great unbreakable bond with my grandparents. Every time I see them, there's always new stories. Thanks for watching. Check me out interpreting scenes for my favorite new show over on Netflix, TikTok. Bye.
That was a great video. All right, a couple more questions, Benro. I went to my alma mater, Illinois School for the Deaf's 185th anniversary last summer. Some alumni mentioned that ISD did segregate Black and white students from being roommates. I was surprised because my late dad's roommate was Black. My dad graduated in 1948, and I wanted to find out more about that. I guess that was more of a statement.
Yeah, that was a great statement. And I do know that the Illinois School for the Deaf, it wasn't formally declared that it had to be segregated. I think maybe there was certain things in certain times that were created, but I do know that Black and whites were integrated in the education setting, in the sports arena, at the cafeteria, the dining hall. That was my understanding for Illinois. I know it's a little bit more of a free state, but if you look at the border state of Missouri, I have heard that there was a segregated school in Kansas City, or Kansas as well has a segregated school, but Illinois is more of a free state because our former president, Abraham Lincoln, he was very much against segregation. He opposed it.
Are you and other Black deaf individuals seeing more and updating differences in Black ASL or ASL? Or was that more of a functional setting for the language, foundational setting for the language?
If I understand correctly, I know some people think that Black ASL is only sign language, and it's not. We are talking about Black ASL is for individuals who actually went to the segregated school and created and used that language with their body language. And once they were integrated, I feel that's when BASL was ending. And at that time, segregation had fell by the wayside so that there was less BASL I don't think it died, but it's been passed down from some children whose parents may have been from that segregated school. I know there's some Black ASL that's been culturally influenced from the AAVE, and that dialect vernacular has developed a little bit of a sign difference. It's really popular. It's like pop culture on what people are signing. So in today's world and terminology, it does seem that it's newer for some people. It's the first time seeing it. It's the same as if you say bro. Oh, okay, bro. Or is it bra? Or is it what are you trying to say? So I think it's like a nickname type of thing, a play on words to try and see, fitting into that culture. Again, it's trying to follow a set of what's pop culture, what's popular, what's used, what's understood by most. And Black ASL does have its own um, diverse way, but I know that was used only in the segregated schools.
This is Shelley, and before we go on to the next question, I want to remind all of you that there is a short 2-question survey that will be at the end. Please take time to answer that. And also, I want to invite at this time for Angela and Herschel to come back on camera. Okay, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Okay, one more question from Eric. Hello, is there a difference in the ASL community between the African and African American populations? Is there an affect based on the diplora?
Remember I had mentioned that American Sign Language is not universal. It is a sign language that has really its own, every foreign country has their own form of sign language and their own grammar. So Africa, I believe, has 54 different countries and or counties, and they all have their own dialect or affect of sign language. So when a person from Africa moves to America and signs African American style, it is a bit different than ASL and BASL because it's coming from the foreign language. When I had went to Brazil, I had visited 2 times. I don't know if you know, Brazil is in Southern America, but is the only country that is not Spanish speaking. It's the only country that's not. So you have Portuguese, and they have their own sign language based on their language. So when I went there, I was faced with 2 challenges. First, I'm an English user and they're Spanish or Portuguese, and then my sign language is from America. They don't use American Sign Language. So I had 2 things I had to face when communicating. I needed an interpreter. I had to bring an interpreter for both. I had an interpreter bring from Brazilian Sign Language to American Sign Language to English, and then English to Portuguese, spoken language. So it means, yes, there are different signs in all parts of the world. It is, again, not universal. And I do know that when I graduated Gallaudet has international students that come to the university from other countries, and there is socialization happening there, and you get to meet all the international students and learn their signs and how they sign a little bit differently. And then you approach another person and they're code switching. They're using a little bit both languages. So I think that's really beautiful, seeing the diversity of languages. And I come from a family that spoke more than 3 languages. I was born able to hear. I spoke 3 languages, and then my mother spoke 6 languages. My father spoke 4 languages, including Russian and French. And I was born in France. So it's really beautiful to have this strong understanding of language and culture. And it is really a beautiful thing. And if you were to travel to Europe, if you want to, if you already have, you would notice how in Europe a lot of people speak more than 2 languages. And they sign more than 1 language as well. I had went to the United Kingdom, and in Britain, it was really hard to understand because they sign with 2 hands. British Sign Language is very different. American Sign Language, we can sign with 1 or 2, but predominantly in British Sign Language, it's 2-handed, like the alphabet's 2-handed. And then when I go over to France, they have international sign language that they use, that they've kind of collaborated with other countries. But in the UK, it is its own language, and it is different. They might speak English with a bit of an accent, but their ASL and their British Sign Language is completely different. Whew, that was a challenge. But it really is a beautiful thing to be able to experience. And I know it's a challenge to communicate with other cultures, with other foreign languages as well. You might understand the barriers.
Well, at this time, thank you so much, Monroe, for your presentation. It's been very informative. But I want to turn it back over to Angela and Herschel for them to give some final thoughts, and if they have any questions, and then they can sign us out when they're ready.
Okay, well, thank you. I appreciate it. I hope that you all have learned something new from this webinar. It's been awesome, and I hope you have a wonderful weekend. Thank you.
Herschel, any last words?
I am so sorry. This is the interpreter speaking on my own behalf. After that last modification, I can't see Herschel and I can't see Angela anymore. And I don't have any way to modify it. He's too tiny for me to see right now.
Can you move a little bit closer, Herschel?
Well, all I
David,
know,
I
I just
changed
made
my
awesome
gallery view. You got to change the view up front, up
I
top.
did.
The gallery.
A
It
little
should
bit
just
better. We'll
be.
try that. Okay, go ahead. Okay, so really, just was really a really eye-opening experience for me, quite honestly. I learned so many new things I'd never really given consideration to previously. However, also got me a lot more to consider things about like deaf people, in the North versus the South. This was very, very different experiences, and their sign language use was so different. And I think about ASL compared to BASL. And so I just thought there was a lot of good opportunities to learn a lot of information for me as well as a deaf Black individual. So it was really good for me. I do really appreciate everybody coming today and learning more about all this new information. It was new for all of us.
All right. Well, thank you,
And
everyone.
also,
Oh, go ahead.
I sure learned a lot. This is Angela speaking because I didn't know, what had happened in that history all that time. And so I think it was really a great education for everyone. We were really lucky to participate today and to hear from Benro. So I just think it's really, really key for other people to be able to share and relate to their education and learn more about Black deaf experiences. So, the culture, the history, wow. So I just really wanted to thank Silk for making this webinar possible. And thank Benro too for your presentation. Well, thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, Benro said.
All right. Well, thank all of you for attending. And I know we had a lot of people that were attending from Rock Valley College. So we're glad to have you on the webinar today. Okay, all of you take care and have a great rest of your afternoon.